Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Pho, founder and editor of KevinMD. Today on the show, we have June Garen. She is a nurse and she is the author of the book, Hey, I Could Use a Little Help Here, My Story of Healthcare Workplace Violence. There's an excerpt from that book on KevinMD titled In Memory of a Nurse Who Died from Injuries Sustained During a Patient Assault. June, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And to all of those who are going to be listening to this, thank you for taking time to spend with us.
So we'll get into your excerpt and book in a little bit. But first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
I decided to go to college and become a social worker. And at the point that I got out of school with my social work degree, sadly, there were no social work jobs. We were in a political climate that had eliminated pretty much a lot of programs. So I floundered a bit and went back to school to become a nurse because I thought, well, that would be the perfect combination. And maybe I could work in a freestanding hospice. And I've yet to even walk into a freestanding hospice because I detoured and spent decades working in the operating room, raised a family, took care of my elderly parents, got divorced, always worked at the bedside. And then when my last child was almost out of college, it was time to kind of revisit, what do you want to do with your legacy years of your career? What do you want to do with what you have left? And so I applied to and was admitted into a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner program and forged ahead. But somewhere along the way, I got a little edgy and wanted to actually go boots on the ground and work in a psychiatric hospital because I thought that would be the way to really get a sense of what I was doing, to start at the ground level, as it were. And so that was kind of where my story began for the book.
So we're going to get into your book in a little bit, and I would like you to talk about that excerpt titled In Memory of a Nurse Who Died from Injuries Sustained During a Patient Assault. But before you get to the excerpt, tell me about the genesis of that book.
Oh, it's a tricky one. I think that part of my healing, because I was assaulted, I was the victim of a pretty significant assault, subarachnoid hemorrhage, depressed skull fracture, multiple injuries. I'm a big fixer, and maybe partly because of being a nurse and partly because of the social work background, I want to see something good come of something bad. I worked a lot of years in, the organ transplant programs, and something good comes of something bad in those programs. And so I needed to have that. And that was probably the start of the genesis. Was I tried to make some headway politically. I tried to raise people's awareness. I tried to explain that we're working in unsafe workplaces, and it all fell on deaf ears. And it's a very political atmosphere. And then I thought, wait a second, I've got my words and I got my voice, and I can get this story out, and it might help somebody else. And I think that was a big piece of healing for me.
So please share your story with my audience and tell me about some of those headwinds that you encountered after sharing that story.
If you wanted to think of what my spirit animal at that point was, it was probably a little lamb, because I just was not getting it that people who represent me in our state legislature would be interested in supporting nursing. It was a very partisan issue. The healthcare industry had lobbyists that were invited to the table. Staff nurses weren't included. And I thought, wow, this is crazy. I thought people loved nurses. I thought they'd want to take care of us. And this would be appalling to people. And even neighbors and associates would make comments to me like, well, what'd you do to piss him off to make him want to assault you? And I thought, I was doing my job, pure and simple. Why am I being blamed? And then I started to see kind of a whole evolution that somehow we're supposed to be perfect and we're supposed to be able to de-escalate anything. And there's really no guarantee or establishment of a safe workplace for a lot of us. I mean, you work in a practice, that can be dangerous. We've all seen that. You don't know who's coming into that room with you. Are there panic buttons available? Will people respond? Do they know how to respond? Those were all really tangible things that I was asking for, and it just kept falling on deaf ears. So I decided, okay, I'll write a book because my words and my story are mine and I can share them. And by being vulnerable and running the risk of being shamed and blamed some more, I might save somebody from going through what I'm going through. I might throw them a lifeline.
So I think that you're right. The public in general, they're not aware of the dangers that healthcare workers across the spectrum face. Now, you have a platform here. There are people listening to your podcast. You did write an excerpt on KevinMD. Please share some stories about some of the dangers and patient assaults against healthcare workers.
Well, it's interesting that you would say that, because I think overall there's an assumption that assaults follow some sort of algorithm, because we love our algorithms, right? Patient comes in, they're not happy, and all of a sudden, they're going to say this, you're going to say that, you're going to hold this position, you're going to move here, you're going to make sure you're by a door. That's not how it shakes out. You don't know who's coming into your office to assault you. You're there to take care of them. You're there to help them. And that may not be, being on the defensive all the time. Well, we have to be. It's tricky, isn't it, to always know, because I'm not a mind reader. I don't know about you, but most of us aren't. And so some of these incidents, like the one that I talked about in the book in the first chapter, Lynne was sort of my inspiration to get up off of my backside and say, I can use my words, I can tell the stories, I can ask other people for their stories. Because Lynne went to work one day at Baton Rouge General Hospital to take care of patients. And by all accounts, she was a lovely nurse and a great person. And one of the patients came after one of her coworkers, and Lynne stepped in at that point to protect her coworker, and sustained injuries that resulted in her death a week later. Those are the things that happen in the real world. There was no chance to use this fancy algorithm that people or employers or the healthcare industry thinks that we could just suddenly move into, because patients didn't get the algorithm for that. They didn't get that algorithm.
So you did tell the tragic story of Lynne Truxillo. What happened in the immediate aftermath? Did anything change to protect the safety of nurses?
No, not that I'm aware of. There was, I think, outrage, and she was quietly buried in New Orleans. And business went on. I've often wondered if the people who she worked with were even able to get time off to go to her funeral or the calling hours. And no, nothing that I'm aware of changed. If anything, I believe they continue to have more violence at that facility.
Now we are, of course, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, 18 plus months, and you hear in other service industries, tensions are riding pretty high. You hear altercations in restaurants and in airplanes. Now, have you noticed an increase in healthcare worker violence during the pandemic?
I think what was bubbling under the surface is somehow, like when you make a pot with water and it just starts to boil, that's where we were at before, that little simmer. And now what I see is the rolling boil hitting sometimes. There's nobody who's immune anymore. School nurses aren't immune. We hear about parents being upset about having their kids wearing masks in schools. We hear about teachers and teachers' aides being assaulted because they're encouraging kids to follow the rules and wear masks. We hear about school nurses being screamed at because you're sending a kid out to be tested for COVID. It's even reached sort of the areas that we thought were kind of safe from it. And I don't know what it's like in the emergency room right now, but I can only imagine how horrific that is, between the critically ill patients showing up, the high emotions around a politicized pandemic, combined with just that whole level of trauma and chaos.
Now, after reflecting on your story and, of course, the stories in your book, what are some things that nurses can do to protect themselves?
You know, in all fairness, one of the things I refer to in the book periodically is chaos theory. Remember, we all had to learn that at some point, where the butterfly's wings beat and it's just a little breeze, but it turns into a tsunami on the other side of the world. So, what can we do? What can we change? What can we do to shift the culture? So, one of the biggest things that I can honestly say we can do is to collect data. We have to collect data. Without data, we can't establish there's a problem, right? And data, the collection for data is next to nil. It's not usable. It's not well organized. So we need to collect data. If we're assaulted in the workplace or if we're verbally threatened, it needs to be documented. It needs to be put in one place. What do we do in the meantime? We start to change our thinking so that we don't accept that behavior. You don't write, disgruntled patient. You actually draw a line in the sand and you say, that's not a productive situation. I want to help you. But if there's aggression in the room, I can't do it adequately. We need to draw that line in the sand of what we're going to accept. We need to hold our employers accountable. You need to give us a safe workplace. You get to have a panic button on your badge when you're in a room with unstable patients. So if you need help, you can push a button and get help in there. You need to have adequate staffing. We need to make our work environment one. We need to demand to have our work environment be one that allows us to be healers, not victims.
We're talking to June Garen. She's a nurse and she's the author of the book, Hey, I Can Use a Little Help Here, My Story of Healthcare Workplace Violence. June, what are some of your take-home messages from the book that you want to leave the KevinMD audience with?
So I think the most important one I can tell you, and I think we can take it home with us and the audience can take it home. You are worth so much. What you bring to the table is so important. Everybody has a seat at the healthcare table, and patients need us and families need us. You are valuable and nobody can replace you. So with that said, and really believing that, just know that you deserve a place to be safe and do what you do best, and that's heal patients. My book is on Amazon. It's on a variety of indie book venues. You can look even on indiebound.org and find it. I'm a big proponent of supporting indie bookstores, but wherever you can find it, I would applaud you for getting it. Or if you have somebody who you love who's been a victim of violence, get it for them.
And since writing the book, tell me some of the responses that you received.
It's been interesting because I think one of the biggest things is that by me being vulnerable and sharing my experience, it's allowed other people to open the door and realize that they were victimized not only by the violence that they experienced, but by the actual healthcare industry and pushing them aside and not taking care of them after they were hurt. And I think that that's been one of the most empowering pieces, is to have a community now and not be healing by myself.
June, thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.